Hello, welcome to Living Where the Sun Don't Shine. We've got a great group of panelists, and I'm really excited to be talking about this topic because I think that putting our characters in unusual situations really does help them develop in ways that you couldn't on a place like the equator. But to start with, let's have our panelists introduce themselves. Can we start with Sarah?
Sure. So my name is Sarah Seeley. I write science fiction, fantasy, and horror. I'm also a Paleolithic archaeologist with a geology background and some biology background as well. And so I'm excited to come to this panel and talk about how to adapt to environments that with limited light.
JL, why don't you go next?
Okay, Jim Curtis, retired naval aviator. I write current fiction, I write science fiction, and my 1870s Western just went live yesterday called Showdown on the River. And I spent 13 years doing R&D for the Navy after I retired. So a little bit of a background in this stuff.
How about you, Nicholas?
In writing circles, I go by Nicholas Adams. I write speculative science fiction and fantasy. My day job is in architecture, and I assume I'm on this panel because I did my master's thesis on a submersible diving school in the Gulf of Mexico.
Ooh.
And my name is Shannon Babb. I get to write nonfiction professionally for Central Utah Water Conservancy District. And I suspect I'm on this panel because I have lived as a scientist 300 miles north of the Arctic Circle, and I'm currently training for an Antarctic expedition. So We probably should start out with a really simple question, which is, why in the world would someone choose to live in a place where the sun don't shine?
Well, a few things. There could be resources that are in a particular location, either a particular location in the world, or if you're going to go a sci-fi route, a particular location in the universe where there's not a lot of sunlight. You might also be looking for certain kinds of organisms that live there to study them. For whatever reason you need to do that. You might go someplace to get away from something. So maybe there's disease, or maybe there's maybe you're hiding from, maybe there's war and you're hiding from somebody. You could go somewhere to try and be incognito and be out of sight, literally, in a place where there's not a lot of light. There could be a lot of reasons, perhaps, to go do that.
I think psychologically, and not referring to people like scientific endeavors, but people who choose to live in an isolated environment where there's little light, I would imagine the appeal is because there's also fewer people. That when you are escaping the large bodies of population, which are mostly around the equator and the temperate regions, you're getting into the more extreme climate conditions. But that also lends to fewer people, fewer nosy neighbors, just a little more, I'm on my own and this is my freedom and I choose to live this way. I think there's a big factor in why people choose to live in these extreme environments.
The only thing I would offer up is, two things. Introvert, get the hell away from everybody else. Places like Cooper Pedy down in Australia, where there is a good reason to live underground because you can make millions of dollars by doing that.
How do you get there?
Should we start with Cooper Pedy and talk about why we would live in a subterranean location? Because the reasons why they live underground there are amazing.
Well, the first and foremost reason is heat, because that is basically in the desert in Australia. And secondly, that's as they dig their homes, they're also mining for fire opals. And those are pretty much worth their weight in gold. So it's a twofer if you want to go look at it from that perspective. And the only thing above the ground is basically their front door. Everything else, including their swimming pools, is underground.
There's a similar place in central Arizona. I can't remember the name of it off the top of my head, but it is a carved out habitation that for the very same reason, just living underground, being protected by the stone because of the heat. But they can go out at night, they go out in the evening. So yeah, they're intentionally limiting their solar exposure because of how it affects you thermally.
I was going to say earth or dirt can serve as a natural insulator. And so you can have like Viking buildings that we find in Iceland are they're earthen, and they kind of go into the slope of a hill, and there's a lot of natural insulation. If you wanted to build kind of a green home, you could actually dig a hole in the ground, like a lot of other people on the panel have kind of talked about that sort of a feature, and it saves on a lot of heating and cooling kinds of things that you need to do. You don't have to regulate quite as much because the earth and environment can serve as a natural insulator.
That's the other oddity with Cooper Pedy is it's 67 degrees year round in their houses.
And architecturally, I mean, historically, before air conditioning, people would have the cellars or the places underneath their houses that would have that consistent temperature. It was cooler as a place to be in the summer, as a place to store their food. And even here in Utah, you can find old barns that are halfway dug in the ground. And one of the reasons why, generally as a society, we've moved away from that, it's the cost of excavation. It costs more money to dig a hole and to partially bury a house than it is to just build from the ground up.
So, Sarah, can we tap some of your geology knowledge?
Sure.
Can you tell us what types of rocks you'd want to build these structures in, and what types of rocks might end up causing problems if they tried to build a subterranean habitat in them?
That is an interesting question. It might depend a little bit on what you want to do with the structure. So limestone has a corrosive element to it. So you do get a lot of natural caves, and so people in the past did live in caves to an extent, and it served as a natural shelter. But you also have issues with this karst effect, where, for example, in Florida, everything's basically limestone, and you get huge sinkholes over time that actually literally envelop people's houses that are built on top of them. So limestone, it depends on the environment, and it can also depend on things like humidity. So Utah, we have more limestone around because it's dry, but if you go someplace like China, where there's a lot of rain, you get some really neat geological features, but you get there's a lot more erosion because of that humidity. So so humidity plays a part in it as well. That's a good question, though, just for digging a structure. In terms of it just kind of depends on what you want to do with it. But softer soils can have other kinds of problems related to flooding or earthquakes or being on a slope or something can all impact whether something stays there or not. And honestly, other things too, like vegetation. So if you want to build something on a slope, having a lot of vegetation around. Yeah, sorry, I'm not quite getting at the rock answer directly, but there's a lot of other environmental factors that kind of go into, as well as the stone itself, what you want to do with that structure. And if you want to blast into something like an igneous rock, it could be more expensive, but it might hold a little better than, say, trying to dig a tunnel in sand. You'll have to put some kind of a concrete tube down into sand or something like that. So there's so there's a lot of environmental factors that go into it, and just kind of depending on what you want to do with it, with the structure.
And that gives some great places to research. If you're going to take it on, looking into the geology can help. Should we move to another thing that is under? Because we've got two people that are really familiar with going submarine and going under the water. So what are some of the things that need to be taken into account in building a submarine community, whether it is a mobile community or a stationary one?
Well, for the mobile community, I've ridden submarines in the Navy. And one of the issues is, excuse me, the lack of vitamin D, which is kind of important. So you've got to either take supplements, or you have to get under a sun lamp, something around 263 to 290 nanometers. And you have to do that periodically to maintain your vitamin D levels. The other thing is the cold, because the deeper you go, the colder it gets, and heat becomes a factor. The another issue is going from red light, because what you want to do is you go to red light in all the passageways and in the con whenever you're in local darkness. So you're constantly shifting as the boat moves when you're going from day to night sequence in your apparent location. And that impacts your ability to sleep. Plus, you're standing 3 watches a day, you're doing 6 on, 12 off. So, again, multiple things that can impact you and do impact you. And you literally lose track of time. You don't know whether you're going, coming, or sideways after about a week.
Another factor that's not necessarily sunlight related when talking about a submersible environment is, if you don't take it with you, you don't have it. There's no just running down to Holiday or 7-Eleven and grabbing something really quick. You have to take it with you, literally. And like Jim was saying, that includes some supplemental for sunlight. So whether it's that sun lamp or just something to give you the just some exposure to our natural environment, then it's medically detrimental in the long run.
So
the other thing that's kind of interesting is you do eat fairly well on a submarine for about the first week and a half. But the longer the patrol goes on, the further down you eat, literally, because you have food stacked in the passageway. So eventually, by the end of the patrol, you're down to pretty much whatever's left in the cans that are on the floor. And you're just hoping you make it back in time to be able to get something besides spam and beans.
One thing I remember learning about submarine life when I was doing some research for my current story is that you periodically do get to go up on the surface, and they have what, correct me if I'm wrong, Jim, a steel deck picnic, where they can set up on the top of the boat and just have some recreation. You're out in the sunlight, you know, whatever you're eating, but you're getting that solar exposure. Whereas if you're in a static underwater environment that is permanently below water, that opportunity doesn't exist. Plus, if you did want to go to the surface, there's the time you have to take into account to slowly ascend, so that your body can adapt to the lower pressure, because you can go down faster than you can come up.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of time factor in going from pressure to standard atmosphere.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but I have been told that when you're, for example, saturation diving and you're staying at a higher pressure, it really messes with your sense of taste and smell. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct.
So that might alter your diet.
Well, nothing tastes good after a while when you're underwater anyway. But I do have one funny story that Nicholas reminded me of. A friend of mine was the other deputy with me at O&R. Was a former submarine CO. And they had been out 120 days, so he decided to do a Steel Beach picnic in the Indian Ocean. The problem was he didn't have any beer. So he was wandering around through the task force out in the Indian Ocean going, anybody got any beer? Anybody got any beer? He found a destroyer that had enough beer that he could give everybody on the submarine 2 cans of beer. So he did an unrep in the Indian Ocean to get each person 2 cans of beer for their Steel Beach picnic. And that's
must
probably
have gone a long way for morale.
Huh?
Must have gone a long way for morale.
Oh yeah, it did.
So, shall we move to the one that I'm the most passionate about, which is the poles? So we've got some military experience, and then we've got some scientific experience on that one. And I'm going to ask, what is it like from the military perspective to live at one of these polar bases?
Well, first and foremost, it's cold. We operated out of Thule, Greenland. The ambient temperature was 60 below zero. The wind chill got down as low as 105. So anything you did outside was very limited. And we were actually flying operational out of there. So it took 5 hours to warm the airplane up before you could even start your normal routine. The other problem was we were in about 22 hours of darkness. So everybody's sleep schedule was screwed up. So the combination of all those things and the pressure of operating in extremely cold weather, you really never got warm. And a lot of people were suffering from muscle cramping. And that was pretty much routine the entire 3 weeks we were up there. Plus the fact that lips dried out, the hands dried out. Just about everybody up there had some form of frostbite on hands and feet.
We were lucky at Toolik Lake. We had a sauna. The scientists do saunas. Scientists also do the 100 and 200 challenge, where they crank up the sauna and see how many degrees Celsius between the inside and the outside they can get, and then they run wearing nothing but shoes around the flagpoles. It's both an Arctic and Antarctic thing. Scientists survive in these by doing really weird things. And the only way that we keep track of time is they pay groups like Raytheon to send up cooks to feed us at scheduled times, because otherwise we'd probably get distracted by pretty snowflakes and get ourselves in trouble.
Well, the other thing, as we had discussed earlier, is seasonally affected disorder. And that is a serious problem in high latitudes, low latitudes, however you want to look at it. Because there are people who are very, very badly affected by the lack of a standard, quote, quote, standard day and night cycle. When you got 22 hours a night, you know, they have they have to deliberately take medication or they have to sleep with a light on.
You know, that's similar to being in solitary confinement. When you don't have regular exposure to natural environment, it messes up your equilibrium, it messes with your head, it totally changes your brain chemistry because you're off of a normal schedule and you're just not, you stop thinking normally because you have no reference of your daily context, environmental context. It messes with you.
Well, not only that, normal circadian rhythm is 25 hours, not 24.
You end up drifting very, very quickly in some of these completely dark environments unless you have something to peg you something regular. How about we do the one which I know that none of us have experience with, which is space. What types of things can we take from our subterranean, our submarine, and our polar experiences? What can we do to tie them to what it would be like to be in space?
Well, I think submarine environment is going to be the most akin to outer space because you are creating a bubble, essentially. It's the opposite of an aquarium, where you are creating an air pocket in a place where an air pocket would naturally dissipate or be destroyed.
You'd have the same, I think you'd have the same issues, or at least I write in mine books, where there is a rhythm that you have to maintain. And what I do is use that through lighting in the ship.
I think, though, in outer space, you would have more access to natural light just because there's nothing to prevent it from coming by. Unless you're so far away, it's virtually dim. Like if you were out near Pluto, I don't know what the solar radiance on the surface of Pluto is like. If it's more like starlight than what it would experience in near Earth orbit, where it's virtually the same solar exposure as we are on the surface.
One of the interesting things is when you look at the sun from Pluto, it looks roughly like Mars does in our sky. So very, very faint. You can tell that it's your star, but only just.
It would be very dark. So you would absolutely have to have some kind of an artificial sun source if you were in a deep space orbit around the sun.
Well, you'd have to have that. You'd also have to have the medical supplements to maintain some sense of normalcy. The other thing is, if you look at, let's say, the ISS, now you're spending time in weightlessness. So now you're dealing with yet another set of issues. And that's where the science really is starting to come into play. A friend of mine, Kay Hire, is an astronaut, well, now former astronaut, and she did time on the ISS. And she said the two biggest problems were one, working out, and two, sleeping, because they never turned the lights off. So they would have to get into their cocoon and zip it shut and then pull the doors closed so they could sleep. And then the other thing was getting any kind of actual exercise. Now, depending on how you want to play with your science fiction, you can have a 1G, standard 1G inertial compensation, or you can have the rings that rotate at different G levels. So many ways to play with that.
You know, you mentioned never turning the light off. And a moment ago, I remember thinking, well, Star Trek, the lights are never off. It's like they have their dark cabin, and then they walk out into the hall, and it's like, oh, it's bright as daylight out here.
Yeah.
And it just makes you wonder, and you had mentioned earlier, Jim, about the submarine, where there are zones of the ship that are brighter or darker, depending on where you're at. And I think that universally over the entire length of this ship out in space, I think it would help that circadian rhythm if all the lights were on or all the lights were off, or at least there is a way to synthesize the cycle of daylight.
Right, and that's one of the things, and I'm not sure who would have the better answer, but obviously one of the science people would, is the work on doing blue shifted light for sleeping. Shannon, Sarah, have either one of y'all run into that?
Blue shifted light for sleeping. I actually don't know a lot about that, to be honest.
I know for a lot of people, moving to the red helps. Blue tends to trigger some of the wake up for some people.
I was going to say, feel like it's actually opposite. Yeah, I was going to say, like, your cell phone has kind of a bright white or kind of a blue light, and that tends to be more rousing, whereas a red light, for example, if you're going to go outside to do astronomy at night, you might use a faint red light so that it doesn't mess up your night vision, sort of a thing.
Well, with cell phones and screens in general, there is a study that people who are reading off their phone or a tablet at night stay up later because of the blue shift in the light coming off their screen keeps them awake. And I tell my wife all the time, because she stays up late reading, I'm like, turn your phone off. If you want to go to sleep, turn your phone off. It's keeping you awake. And it's also why kids with too much screen time are having sleep problems, because they're getting too much stimulus, that at night they have a hard time going to sleep because there's something in the blue light that triggers your brain to be alert.
Huh. The reason I asked the question, I know some people that are working on light changes or light color changes for the military to allow people to sleep. And one of the things they've been most successful with is a darker blue shifted light, which really goes against what all y'all are saying, which is kind of interesting.
But maybe it's
that
just
is
the
interesting.
wavelength of the blue.
Yeah, it could be.
So
Because you have different color temperatures. You have warm white, you have cool white, and it actually has a psychological effect. That's why lighting design in architecture, they really take into account what color light does this space need to be. Does it need to be warm, or does it need to be cool? Does it need to be inviting or just stimulating and get out kind of thing?
So let's create a hypothetical community that's going to live in one of these environments. We know that they're not going to have the sunshine. They're not going to see the light of day for at least 6 months. Let's figure out, how are they going to power their society? What are some of the tools that they can use to power them if we take away solar power and those resources?
Well, the cleanest would be nuke power, small nuclear reactor. And that would also generate.
Oh, I was going to say, I would probably go to something like bringing some kind of genetically modified algae or something that kind of generates its own light. You could bring something like that and make it harmless so that it's non-toxic if you get it on yourself or something, but you could have some kind of living source that's producing its own light. I guess if this was something very sci-fi, you could even create some kind of a skin implant, so there's like a little
And it looks like we lost her again. I would say, to follow that vein, hydroponics too.
Well, are we talking about power or light?
Play
Because you mentioned, how are we going to power this station?
There.
So let's stick with power. Lighting is just one aspect, but we could create a society that chooses to not use their eyes to navigate, but you're still going to need some form of power for your society. Might be muscle power, but muscle power societies tend to not be much fun.
They're also very labor intensive, and we are weak creatures compared to other animals in the kingdom. So just human power, and if we're also still talking out in space, then I don't think power in space is feasible in the slightest.
The other thing would be that you would tend to run off most of the community, because you would only want the strongest to be there and working, which would mean anybody that was weak, anybody that was frail, anybody that had a problem would either be kicked out or thrown out or leave voluntarily.
A byproduct of a manually labor spacefaring society would be you're burning up more calories, so you're going to need to consume more calories. You are going to be sweating, so there's water replenishment. There's going to be odor with all of that manual labor. Carbon dioxide is going to be produced very rapidly. So you would need some kind of a system that's going to account and recirculate everything, so that this finite amount of resources is not wasted.
Something like the scrubbers that y'all used in the underwater habitat, like we use on submarines.
And even those don't last forever. They have a limited use.
Right.
Which is why you eventually have to go up top and recycle your air. And why having plant life is so important to supplement. You had mentioned hydroponics. You would need some type of a greenhouse, at the very least, to supplement your CO2 scrubbers, and as a way to grow some food.
Right.
Because like I said earlier, if you don't take it with you, you don't have it.
Well, I was going down the road that I thought Sarah would go down before she died on us. There was the hydroponics, and you use that through UV light or natural radiation to continue the hydroponics. So, Sarah, back to you.
Yeah. Another thing, just for different kinds of power sources, you could look at geothermal, where you're literally tapping like the Earth's convection from volcanism that's going inside the Earth. So you might need to find places where you're more likely to get some of that heat compared to other places. I'm looking at tectonic activity, but that's a way that you could just generally power electricity sorts of things for a community with geothermal.
Yeah, Iceland does that in the military barracks up there. They had no water heaters and no heaters in the buildings. Everything was geothermal. You got 170 degrees out of your tap.
But how far down did you have to drill to get that?
Not that far.
Really?
The Blue Lagoon, just off the base, had 130 degrees at the surface.
I was going to say it depends. It depends on like the volcanic activity and just what's going on with tectonic plates and things like that. Oh no, we lost Shannon. Rough panel today.
Yeah. Are there any questions from the audience that are? I don't know. I don't know where to find the questions from the audience.
Yes, we do have a few questions.
Okay.
The first one is from Miranda Moore, and she asked, what methods for lighting slightly more primitive than electricity could you have underground?
Methods for lighting besides electricity.
Other than electricity. Well, there's flame-based. So you have oil, wax, things like that. And as Sarah mentioned, I also really like the idea of some kind of bioluminescence, whether it's animal or vegetable. There are several creatures that have something. It's not very bright. I mean, maybe you could get a whole giant swarm of fireflies, or engineer a bioluminescent plant or algae that has more output, but you're essentially limited to the chemical. If it's not electrical, it's basically a chemical reaction.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And that includes the
because you can have things.
sticks.
Yeah, glow sticks. Yeah.
But the chemical reaction wears out, which is why they fade.
Yeah. The other problem with using oil-based or, like torches, if you want to go back that far, is you generate a lot of CO2. You generate very little heat, and you have to replace them on a fairly rigid basis if you're going to keep any light in the area. Mm-hmm. So that's going to mean you're either going to have to go outside, find more, bring them back in, or you're going to have to drill, or any number of other ways. Whereas if you bioengineer something, that at least would be a fairly stable source.
Yeah, so get your bioluminescent skin patch, everyone, and then you can go underground.
Walk around holding your arm out with a light.
Yes. And just turn your hand on, and just use that to guide you.
One way to maximize electrical lighting, though, is LED. You can get a lot of light out of a few LEDs that take up very little power. So if you have to go electrical, if that's where you want to go, then just simple LED systems put out a lot of light and consume very little power. And
generate very little heat.
So you could have an LED suit and just then have no external lights in your environment. You are your own glow stick.
There she is. She's back.
And I get to tell you that it's pretty much time to ask for some questions from the audience.
Well, we already started.
Oh no.
So,
any other questions from the audience?
Zella asked if you wanted to build a small city in a cave, what would be the best type of rock to look for, particularly if you wanted to make the city last. For example, we might want to avoid limestone erosion.
The harder the stone,
so for avoiding
last, and the harder it is to build your environment. I would say at a minimum you would want to use like a sandstone. It's fairly stable, but it's a little more. You can dig into it, put into it easier than say granite.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the problem with granite is you have to blast pretty much, and also it tends to fragment, and it can crack, and the whole thing can fall down on your head.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing is you would have to build in supports. I say build in, either design in supports or put in some kind of support structure, depending on the size of the roof.
And you can go into like a natural cave system that does have a limestone base in it. But yeah, the thing is that over time, a cave is naturally going to change in terms of, so water will drip out of the ceiling and it'll cause the different formations in there to kind of grow together and close off different parts. Or you could have like stalagmites and stalactites that could be brittle and could fall on people. Or you could eventually have parts of the cave collapse. So that is part of the challenge if you're going to do something in like a limestone type of an environment. But that would in a lot of ways be the easiest, is to already find a cave that already exists and to move in there. so particularly if there's a natural disaster or something and people need to go live in caves, they might not have a lot of resources to do blasting and things like that. But people, you could certainly live in a regular limestone cave as a small group and make it work.
The other thing you would want to know is what's the depth of the water table and where are you going to get water, A, and B, how often is the cave going to flood?
Mm-hmm.
So that place in Arizona that I mentioned earlier, it's called Arcosanti.